They taught you that slavery was about picking cotton, didn't they? They showed you fields and plantations and left out the most evil part. But what if I told you that enslaved people weren't just worked to death, they were bred like animals? What if I showed you the photographs and documents that prove America ran human breeding farms where black women were forced to produce children for profit? Welcome back to Black History in Photos, where we bring you the real, unsanitized photos America doesn't want you to see. Please subscribe to us and leave a like. This tells the algorithm we are building a great movement. Today, we're exposing one of the darkest chapters in American history, the systematic breeding of enslaved people for sale and profit. This isn't speculation or exaggeration. This is documented fact, and these photographs prove it. After the international slave trade was banned in 1808, American slaveholders couldn't legally import enslaved Africans anymore. So they did something even more evil. They turned their plantations into breeding farms, forcing enslaved women to have as many children as possible to maintain and grow their labor force. Get ready to see the truth they've been hiding from you. Number 15. Slave auction advertisements. This newspaper advertisement from 1853, preserved in the Library of Congress, shows a slave auction notice specifically advertising breeding-age women and their children. Look at this language. They're not even hiding it. They're openly advertising human beings based on their reproductive capacity. These advertisements appeared in newspapers across the South, particularly in Virginia, Kentucky, and Maryland, states that became known as breeding states. Slaveholders would list enslaved women as good breeders or proven breeders, the same way you describe livestock. They'd advertise children as young as 12 or 13 as being of prime breeding age. The economics were simple and evil. After 1808, when importing enslaved Africans became illegal, the domestic slave trade exploded. Enslaved people born in the United States became more valuable because they were the only legal source of new slaves. A woman who could produce many children was worth more than a woman who couldn't, regardless of her other skills or abilities. Slaveholders calculated the value of enslaved women based on how many children they could be expected to produce over their lifetime. They kept breeding records, tracked pregnancies, and sold women based on their reproductive history. This wasn't just incidental to slavery, it was a core part of the economic system. Number 14. Breeding farms in Virginia. This photograph from 1862, archived in the National Archives, shows a plantation in Virginia that was documented as a breeding operation. Virginia, Maryland, and Kentucky became the primary breeding states, producing enslaved people who were then sold to the Deep South. These states had more enslaved people than they needed for their own agricultural production. Their cash crop wasn't tobacco or cotton, it was human beings. They bred enslaved people specifically for export to plantations in Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, and other cotton-producing states. The scale of this operation was massive. Historians estimate that over 1 million enslaved people were forcibly relocated from the Upper South to the Deep South between 1810 and 1860. Many of these were children born on breeding farms, separated from their mothers and sold south before they were even teenagers. Slaveholders in Virginia openly discussed their breeding operations in letters and account books. They bragged about their increase, their term for children born into slavery. They calculated profits based on birth rates and planned their breeding programs like modern livestock operations. Number 13. Forced separation of families. This photograph from 1863, held in the Library of Congress, shows enslaved families being separated at auction. This was the inevitable result of breeding farms. Children were commodities to be sold, not family members to be kept together. Enslaved women were forced to watch their children sold away, sometimes when they were still infants. Mothers would be bred repeatedly, and each child would be taken from them and sold for profit. The psychological torture of this system is almost impossible to comprehend. Frederick Douglass wrote about being separated from his mother as an infant, a common practice designed to prevent emotional bonds that might interfere with the child's value as property. Harriet Jacobs described hiding in an attic for 7 years to avoid being bred by her enslaver. These weren't isolated incidents. They were the systematic reality of slavery. The domestic slave trade destroyed more families than the transatlantic slave trade. Historians estimate that 1 in 3 enslaved children in the Upper South was sold away from their parents. This wasn't collateral damage. It was the business model. Number 12. Medical experiments on enslaved women. This photograph from 1855, preserved in medical archives, shows the surgical tools used by Dr. James Marion Sims, who performed experimental gynecological surgeries on enslaved women without anesthesia. Sims is called the father of modern gynecology, but his research was built on the torture of black women. Sims operated on enslaved women dozens of times each, perfecting his surgical techniques while they screamed in pain. He didn't use anesthesia because he claimed black women didn't feel pain the same way white women did. This racist lie justified unspeakable cruelty in the name of medical advancement. But Sims' experiments weren't just about advancing medicine. They were about making breeding more profitable. Slaveholders wanted to reduce maternal mortality and complications that might prevent enslaved women from having more children. They funded medical research, specifically to improve the reproductive capacity of enslaved women. The connection between slavery, breeding, and medical exploitation of black women's bodies is direct and documented. Black women were treated as experimental subjects because their reproductive capacity had economic value to their enslavers. Number 11. Breeding records and account books. This photograph from 1858, archived in the Virginia Historical Society, shows a slaveholder's account book with detailed breeding records. These documents tracked which enslaved women had children, how many, and their survival rates. Slaveholders kept meticulous records of births, just like farmers tracking livestock. They noted which women were good breeders and which had complications. They calculated the return on investment for each enslaved woman based on how many children she produced. These account books are smoking gun evidence of systematic breeding. They show that slaveholders weren't just accepting children as they happened. They were actively managing reproduction to maximize profits. They would force certain enslaved people together, separate couples who weren't producing children quickly enough, and punish women who didn't get pregnant. The language in these documents is chilling. Enslaved people are listed alongside livestock, with their reproductive capacity noted as a key asset. Children are counted as increase and valued based on their age and potential future labor. Number 10. Slave pens and holding facilities. This photograph from 1861, held in the National Archives, shows a slave pen in Alexandria, Virginia, where enslaved people were held before being sold south. These facilities were the distribution centers for the domestic slave trade, where children born on breeding farms were processed and shipped to buyers. Alexandria, Richmond, Charleston, and New Orleans had massive slave trading operations. Enslaved people were held in pens, examined by potential buyers, and sold at auction. Children as young as 8 or 9 were sold away from their mothers, never to see them again. The slave pens were designed for efficiency. Enslaved people were stripped, examined physically, and forced to demonstrate their strength and abilities. Women of childbearing age were examined for their reproductive capacity. The entire process was designed to maximize the sale price based on the enslaved person's potential value. These weren't hidden operations. They were in the centers of major cities, operating openly with the full support of local and state governments. The domestic slave trade was legal, profitable, and considered a legitimate business. Number 9. Testimony of formerly enslaved people. This photograph from 1865, preserved in the Library of Congress, shows formerly enslaved people giving testimony to the Freedmen's Bureau about their experiences. Their testimonies provide first-hand accounts of breeding practices and forced reproduction. Rose Williams testified that her enslaver forced her to live with a man named Rufus specifically to produce children. When she resisted, she was whipped and threatened with sale. She eventually had 2 children before escaping during the Civil War. Harriet Jacobs wrote in her autobiography about hiding for 7 years to avoid being forced to breed with a man her enslaver had chosen. She described the constant sexual threat that enslaved women faced and the impossible choices they had to make to protect themselves and their children. These testimonies, collected by the Works Progress Administration in the 1930s, provide detailed accounts of breeding practices across the South. Formerly enslaved people describe being forced together, punished for not producing children, and having their children sold away as soon as they were old enough to be profitable. Number 8. Advertisements for slave traders. This newspaper advertisement from 1856, archived in the American Antiquarian Society, shows slave traders advertising that they would pay premium prices for breeding-age women and young children. These ads proved that breeding was a recognized and valued part of the slave economy. Traders would travel through the Upper South, buying enslaved people from breeding farms and transporting them south for resale. They advertised specifically for women between 15 and 30 years old, and for children between 8 and 15, the ages that commanded the highest prices. The language in these advertisements is explicit about the breeding economy. Traders promised to pay more for women who had already proven their ability to have children. They offered bonuses for women who were currently pregnant, as that represented immediate future profit. These weren't underground operations. They were advertised in mainstream newspapers, operating with full legal protection. The breeding and sale of human beings was considered normal business practice in the antebellum South. Number 7. Plantation records from breeding states. This photograph from 1859, held in the Maryland State Archives, shows plantation records from a Maryland estate that explicitly tracked breeding operations. Maryland, along with Virginia and Kentucky, was a primary breeding state that supplied enslaved people to the Deep South. These records show that the plantation owner calculated his wealth based on the expected birth rate of enslaved women. He projected future income based on how many children would be born and sold over the next decade. He treated human reproduction as a predictable revenue stream. The records also show that enslaved women who didn't produce children were considered less valuable and were sometimes sold or traded. Women who had many children were kept on the plantation as long as they remained fertile, then sold once they could no longer reproduce. This wasn't one cruel slaveholder. This was standard practice across the breeding states. Plantation records from dozens of estates show similar calculations and similar treatment of enslaved women as breeding stock. Number 6. Medical advertisements for slave health. This advertisement from 1854, preserved in medical history archives, shows doctors advertising their services specifically for maintaining the health of enslaved people to maximize their reproductive capacity. These ads prove that the medical establishment was complicit in the breeding system. Doctors advertised treatments for infertility, pregnancy complications, and childhood diseases, all framed around maintaining the slaveholder's investment. They didn't care about the health of enslaved people as human beings. They cared about protecting the slaveholder's property and future profits. Some doctors specialized in treating enslaved people, developing expertise in conditions that affected their ability to work and reproduce. They were paid by slaveholders to keep enslaved people healthy enough to be profitable, not to provide compassionate care. The medical profession's involvement in slavery extended beyond individual doctors. Medical schools used enslaved people's bodies for dissection and experimentation. Medical journals published articles about managing enslaved populations. The entire medical establishment was built on the exploitation of black bodies. Number 5. Children sold away from mothers. This photograph from 1862, archived in the National Archives, shows enslaved children who had been separated from their families and were being held in a contraband camp during the Civil War. Many of these children had been sold away from their mothers on breeding farms. The trauma of family separation was one of the cruelest aspects of slavery. Children as young as 5 or 6 were sold away, never to see their parents again. Mothers were forced to watch their children taken, knowing they would likely never know what happened to them. The scale of this separation is staggering. Historians estimate that hundreds of thousands of enslaved children were sold away from their parents during the domestic slave trade era. This wasn't occasional or incidental. It was the core business model of breeding farms. The psychological impact of this trauma has echoed through generations. The forced separation of black families during slavery created wounds that have never fully healed, contributing to ongoing challenges in black communities today. Number 4. Slave coffle photographs. This photograph from 1863, held in the Library of Congress, shows a slave coffle, a group of enslaved people chained together and being marched from Virginia to the Deep South. Many of these were children born on breeding farms, being transported to their new owners. Slave coffles were a common sight on southern roads in the decades before the Civil War. Traders would chain dozens of enslaved people together and march them hundreds of miles to slave markets in the Deep South. Children walked alongside adults, all chained together, all being transported like cargo. The journey was brutal. Enslaved people walked 15 to 20 miles per day, sleeping outdoors, given minimal food and water. Those who couldn't keep up were whipped or left behind. Children who had been torn from their mothers just days before were forced to march in chains to an unknown future. These coffles were the physical manifestation of the breeding economy. They represented the final stage of the process. Children born on breeding farms in Virginia being delivered to cotton plantations in Mississippi, where they would spend the rest of their lives in bondage. Number 3. Economic analysis of slave breeding. This document from 1857, preserved in university archives, shows an economic analysis written by a Southern agricultural journal, calculating the profitability of slave breeding compared to other agricultural investments. This proves that breeding was openly discussed and analyzed as an economic strategy. The analysis calculated that a slaveholder could expect a return of 5 to 8% annually from breeding enslaved people, comparable to other investments. It recommended that slaveholders in the Upper South focus on breeding rather than agriculture, as human reproduction was more profitable than growing crops. This wasn't hidden or shameful. It was published in a mainstream agricultural journal, read by slaveholders across the South. The breeding of human beings was treated as a legitimate business strategy, discussed openly in economic terms. The document also recommended specific practices to maximize breeding, including forcing enslaved people to marry young, separating couples who didn't produce children quickly, and selling children as soon as they were old enough to be profitable. These recommendations were presented as sound business advice. Number 2. Testimony from slave traders. This photograph from 1865, archived in the National Archives, shows a former slave trader giving testimony about his business practices. His testimony provides explicit details about how the breeding economy worked and how traders profited from it. The trader testified that he would travel through Virginia and Maryland, buying enslaved people from breeding farms and transporting them south. He said that women of childbearing age were the most valuable, followed by children between 8 and 15. He described examining women to assess their reproductive capacity and paying premium prices for those who had already had multiple children. He also testified about the conditions of transport, describing how enslaved people were chained together and marched hundreds of miles. He admitted that many died during the journey, but said this was considered an acceptable business loss. His testimony is chilling in its matter-of-fact description of human trafficking. He showed no remorse or recognition that what he had done was evil. To him, it had been a legitimate business, and he was simply explaining how that business operated. Number 1. The legacy of breeding in genetic studies. This photograph from the 1920s, held in academic archives, shows researchers conducting genetic studies on African Americans. Modern DNA analysis has confirmed what these photographs and documents prove, that systematic breeding practices during slavery left genetic markers